The coffee was consumed, and the nation was sold? In the history of Latin America, coffee was never just a drink. It was a weapon, more powerful than guns, quieter than bombs, and far more effective at controlling entire nations. This is the story of a war financed by coffee and of countries that became hostages to a single crop. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Latin America had become the world's primary supplier of coffee. Brazil, Colombia, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua all built their economies around one single product: coffee exports. At the same time, coffee stopped being a luxury in Europe and the United States. It became a daily necessity. Demand exploded, and where demand grows, power follows. For Latin American governments, coffee became the main source of foreign currency. National budgets, armies, railways, ports, and public administration all depended on the money earned from exporting coffee. On paper, these countries looked prosperous. In reality, they were dangerously fragile. Because when an entire nation depends on one crop, whoever controls that crop controls the country. Coffee production required massive plantations, huge labor forces, and access to international markets. Local elites, often a small group of landowners, took control of the most fertile land. Small farmers were pushed out. Indigenous communities were displaced. Entire rural populations were forced into low-paid plantation labor. Governments passed laws that favored these plantation owners, land privatization acts, forced labor policies, and harsh tax systems. The state itself became an extension of the coffee elite. But even these elites didn't truly control the system. The real power sat thousands of miles away in foreign banks. European and American banks began offering loans to Latin American governments, using future coffee exports as collateral. On the surface, these loans were for development, infrastructure, modernization, and stability. In reality, they created dependency. If coffee prices stayed high, governments could repay their debts. But if prices fell or if exports were disrupted, entire national economies collapsed overnight. And coffee prices were never stable. They fluctuated wildly. Overproduction caused crashes. Economic crises in Europe or the United States reduced demand. Every dip in price meant less revenue for governments that had already committed that money to debt repayments. To keep borrowing, governments made brutal choices. They cut public spending, increased taxes on the poor, and repressed labor movements. This is where coffee money turned into war money. In Central America especially, coffee-financed states became militarized. Armies were expanded not to defend borders but to protect plantations, suppress strikes, and crush political opposition. Foreign banks and corporations had a clear interest: stability for exports, not democracy. Whenever a reformist government threatened land redistribution, labor rights, or national control over exports, it was labeled unstable. Loans were frozen. Credit was cut. Economic pressure followed. And when pressure wasn't enough, violence came next. Civil wars erupted across the region. In countries like Colombia, decades of internal conflict were fueled by an export-based economy that enriched a few while impoverishing millions. Coffee revenues financed weapons, militias, and state forces, while foreign creditors continued to collect interest regardless of the human cost. In Central America, authoritarian regimes used coffee income to maintain brutal military governments. Political dissent was treated as a threat to economic stability. Journalists, union leaders, and peasants disappeared. These wars were not accidents. They were financially sustainable because coffee kept flowing and debts kept being paid. The most dangerous part of this system was how invisible it seemed. There was no single invasion, no official declaration of economic warfare, just contracts, loans, and export agreements. On paper, everything looked legal, profitable, and orderly. But entire nations had lost their freedom of choice. They couldn't diversify their economies because creditors demanded continued coffee production. They couldn't raise wages because profits were needed for debt payments. They couldn't stop wars because the military was funded by export revenue. Coffee had turned from a crop into a chain. By the mid-20th century, the consequences were undeniable. Extreme inequality, political instability, and endless conflict defined many coffee-dependent states. Even when global institutions tried to stabilize prices through agreements, the damage was already done. Generations had grown up under systems designed to serve foreign markets, not local people. A single drink, consumed comfortably in New York, London, or Paris, had been paid for with blood, land, and sovereignty elsewhere. This is why the phrase matters. The coffee was consumed, and the nation was sold, because every cup represented more than just flavor. It represented a financial system where banks profited from instability, elites protected their power through violence, and ordinary citizens paid the price. Coffee didn't just finance economies, it financed repression, it financed wars, it financed silence, and the most chilling part, most of the world never even noticed. This wasn't just the story of coffee. It was the story of what happens when a country becomes dependent on a single export, and when global finance turns everyday consumption into a tool of control. A war was fought, not always with guns, but it was paid for one cup at a time. If you found this story eye-opening, please subscribe to see more hidden histories. Thanks for watching.